Today I need you to lean all the way in. A clinical research leader with over 15 years of global trial oversight, cutting monitoring costs by 26%, reducing query timelines by 30%, and maintaining zero critical findings across FDA, EMA, MHRA inspections.
So monitoring is a sponsor task. We still have to walk the line and explain why it is that we did things the way that we did. Communication in general and escalation is probably the biggest blind spots that we see. You need to have a written process and a dedicated person, team, position to your oversight. And the inspectors and the regulatory agencies will tell you that when they come out to, do their inspections. They're going to say, this doesn't qualify as oversight.
TMF Elite, today I need you to lean all the way in. A clinical research leader with over 15 years of global trial oversight, phase 1 to phase 3, who has mastered risk-based monitoring, vendor management, and multi-million-dollar study portfolios. Ellie Houston is the one teams call when they need inspection-ready quality. She's built monitoring functions from the ground up, driven strategic risk management, and delivered real outcomes, cutting monitoring costs by 26%, reducing query timelines by 30%, and maintaining zero critical findings across FDA, EMA, MHRA inspections. She's led rare disease vaccine and gene therapy trials at the highest level. And today, she's here to level you up. TMF Elite, get ready for the ultimate monitoring oversight and TMF QC masterclass. Ellie, welcome to the TMF Daily Podcast.
Thank you so much. It's so exciting to be here today.
We are so happy to have you here and to share your knowledge. So let's get to it. When you step into a study, day one, what are those absolute non-negotiables that define that world-class monitoring oversight?
So when we're talking about oversight of a study, and so, really to define that is, sponsors' oversight of their studies. And as we know, most sponsors outsource that to CROs or some type of, FSP company that's going to kind of take over that monitoring for them. But what's really important to understand from all sides of studies is that just like an investigator can delegate tasks to site staff, but they're still ultimately responsible for that information, the same goes for sponsors when they outsource their tasks. So monitoring is a sponsor task, and we are outsourcing it to the CRO or other companies, but we are still responsible for it. We still have to walk the line and explain why it is that we did things the way that we did and how things are going. So it's super, super important for the sponsor to have a really clear oversight plan so that they can show the regulators and the people that come in and look at our studies that, yes, we did outsource this to somebody, but we didn't give up everything, and we had a good understanding of what was going on. And the best way to do that is to make sure that you're looking at objective KPIs that are going to show you really what is going on with your monitoring from a very objective, non-persuasive way. So you're not taking into account opinions or attitudes or the people part of things. You're really looking at the actual processes and what's going on. So right off the bat, it's really just understanding, what exactly your study needs in terms of monitoring, how that works, and then setting up a plan to ensure that you're watching that carefully and you're able to provide mitigations and help when needed, because we all know that things come up throughout a study and you're going to need to change on the fly and be ready to do that.
Let's chat about TMF completeness. Like, how do you define true TMF completeness? Not like the industry version, but the standard that really drives that excellence.
So from an oversight perspective and from a monitoring perspective specifically, I really want to see those documents in real time. It's so important at the sponsor level to be able to go into my TMF and have all of those documents readily available to me. That's my insight to what's going on at a site. That's my insight to what's going on with the health of my study. So my monitoring reports, my follow-up letters, protocol deviation reporting, anything IRB related, those day-to-day things, the training, the CVs, all of that. If it's not in the TMF, as a sponsor, we can't confirm that it's there. And if we can't confirm that it's there, we don't have oversight. And we just have to assume that it doesn't exist. We talk so much in research about how if it's not documented, it didn't happen. Well, from a sponsor perspective, the TMF is our documentation of what's happening. So for us, it's just so vital that those things are filed in as near real time as possible, and not just at the end of the study, or not quarterly, or not, twice a year, because we can't see into what's going on, and we can't help and facilitate in the ways that we need to be able to if that information isn't filed immediately or as close to as possible. So for me, that's really the important part of it, and to kind of break it into, not just what a regulatory, expectation is, but just from a day-to-day process level, it really needs to be available to us.
In our industry, we talk about real time a lot. And real time means something different to everybody. Like, what's acceptable for real time?
And that's a great question, because it is loosely defined, and everybody does kind of have a different expectation. So for me, real time falls into whatever parameters you've written into your monitoring plan or your TMF readiness plan, or whatever processes you have in place. But for a monitoring visit, for example, if a CRA goes out to a site and they collect documents at that visit, real time for me is that when that report for that visit is finalized, those documents should be in the TMF. So I don't expect them to necessarily upload it the day that they're on site, or maybe even the day after, or what have you, because I know I was a CRA for many years. You're on the road, you're traveling, there's a million things, your hair's always on fire, it's a lot going on. But by the time your report is finalized, those documents should be in place. So for me, that's really it. And that depends on what your study parameters are. That's usually like 15 business days. So it's not like we're talking about like, oh my gosh, you have to file this second. But within that reasonable amount of time is what I would consider.
What are the biggest blind spots like you consistently see holding teams back from elite oversight across from those phase 1 to phase 3 trials?
There's a lot, actually. So to narrow it down, I would say that communication in general and escalation is probably the biggest blind spots that we see, and that really follows across. I mean, that's for anything across the board. Monitoring really touches on everything that happens in a study. Our CRAs are literally our lifeline. They're our eyes and our ears and our, everything. And it's so important that what they see and what they do gets escalated in a timely fashion, which is why, having those things filed in TMF and that quote unquote real time is so important, because that's one way that we see those things. But then also, communication plans, are they escalating it internally to their teams so that their teams can, escalate it to the sponsor? Are they getting back to the sites in time so that the sites have the information that they need? All of those things that seem so mundane and just sort of, common sense, which isn't always common anymore. But it's so important that those things are really followed up on and done appropriately. And when you have, especially really large global studies where you have these huge teams, if you don't have really clear communication pathways, so many things that you think are just so like run of the mill can end up getting missed or not addressed appropriately, or not in the timely fashion that we'd like, because it hasn't been communicated the way that we would expect it to be.
So you just unpacked a lot right there. And I want to talk about two things you mentioned. One is the communication part. In our industry, there's sort of like we either over communicate or under communicate. Where do we find that balance of communication?
That's the magic, the golden ticket, so to speak, in research. It's hard, and I think that part of that is determined by the risk level of your study, the size of your study, all of those things that kind of go into your risk. And we incorporate that a lot with our oversight in general. Um, but when you fully do a risk assessment of your protocol and your study, you can kind of determine, what things are needed, what should be escalated immediately, within 24 hours, what can wait, up to a week, or, what can just be passed through with your report, things like that. So by really e- evaluating those types of things helps you lay out a good communication plan. And that's different for every study. It really varies based on your indication and, what your primary endpoints are. Is it a safety study? Is it an efficacy study? Those types of questions and those things really, steer the communication plan and how it should work. But having a good assessment of that, and then having a strongly you know, good plan to really just make that, possible. And then trained on that plan is the other piece of that is, making sure that everybody understands what that process is and that they know who to go to. And so, having the roles, clearly defined, if you have this problem, you go to this person. If you have that problem, it goes here, or, streamlining that so it all goes to a central point. It all depends on the size and what's going on with your study, but just really making sure that that's defined well, I think really makes the difference.
So the second thing you touched upon was escalation.
Mhm.
And let's give an example. You're a CRA, you're on site. What do you find that needs to get escalated to like a CTM?
So there's many things that can get escalated. I think first and foremost, we talk about the big ones is, eligibility criteria, informed consent processes, training, and qualifications of the staff at the site. I mean, those are three really big ones. And then of course safety, I think, is the big ticket one that everybody is probably most aware of. Of course, if you have safety issues or potentially unreported safety issues, that's a huge one. But so those really cover the big things, but there are other things as well. I mean, if you have concerns about, the source documentation at a site, for example, if it's not meeting all of your Alcoa principles, and you have concerns about, if your source is truly, good source and, accurate and, able to be used, that is something that shouldn't be sat on, either. And those escalation points, or categories, should be spelled out within your communication plan so that everybody's trained and is very well aware of what they should be escalating. But when it comes to site issues and a CRA being on site, I always default to, it's better to escalate it and have somebody come back and say, oh, it's not that big of a deal and it's fine, than to be like, maybe I'll just wait and they'll see it in my report and then it not get the attention that it needs. So I always err on the side of caution when it comes to things like that.
Risk-based monitoring is sort of a buzzword. We're hearing a lot about it, but how do you execute it in a way that's actually transforms the quality?
That is an industry-wide topic of great, as you've said, everybody speaks about it. Everybody kind of has their own ideas about it. I think we're getting to a point now, risk-based monitoring has really been pushed heavily, in E2 and now in E3 even more so. So I think we're finally coming to a point in our industry where we've kind of made some decisions that work across the board, but it really does fall back to that risk evaluation. Obviously, risk-based monitoring. But the piece that I find missing with so many studies and so many projects is there's not that really good evaluation of the risk from the very start of the study. I mean, your risk evaluation should start when you write your protocol, and you should, be embedding those risk factors and things right in from the very start. And those will help you develop a good risk-based monitoring plan. I personally like to build my risk-based monitoring setup on what are our primary and secondary endpoints of the study. That is the bread and butter of what's going on. That is what's going to get us across the line into, commercialization and approvals. So those areas need to be monitored the most. They need to have the most eyes on them. And that could be the CRAs going out to the site. That could be the central monitors. That could be, data management and EDC, whatever those processes are. But those are the areas you really want to focus on. And then all of the other stuff that we collect, it's not that it's not important, but it's not necessarily as vital to be looked at in the same way that those areas are looked at. So when I sit down with my team and we come up with how are we going to monitor, are we going to do 50%? Are we going to do 80%? Are we going to do every other subject? Are we going to, whatever that process is, and the CROs are pretty good about having their, baked in processes that they've worked on. I really, really look at, are we covering those endpoints that we need? And we know for sure that we have good insight to that. And then the rest of it is all kind of falls into that nice to have, section when you're talking about, this is what we need to have, this is what we would love to have. And how do you come into the middle of that is different for every project.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of like when you're buying a house, like these are the must-haves, and if it has all the rest, great, but if it doesn't, no big deal.
Exactly. Everybody needs a stove, but if it's chrome plated or not, is different, based on what your needs are. So absolutely.
Now, you've maintained zero critical findings in global inspections. What are the daily disciplines, your systems that make that level of consistency possible?
So I worked on COVID vaccines. So that's where I kind of got my feet wet in oversight specifically, when I really went from just monitoring to oversight and on the sponsor side. And we went through, I can't even count how many different inspections we went through. It felt like every 6 weeks or so, somebody was knocking on the door, asking questions and doing things, because it was, just an incredible time. And anybody that worked on those vaccines knows that it was unlike anything else in research that we've seen in at least modern times. So for me, the big things is making sure that your process is written in a way that you're not going to harm yourself by what you've written in your process. So you want it to be very clear and very precise, but you don't want it so precise that you trip up yourself with the day-to-day things that happen. So you want to make sure that your processes are written in a way that you do have some wiggle room on how things fluctuate. Because as we all know from day to day, what we need to do today is different than tomorrow. And then next week, it's probably going to change again. So you need to have that leverage written into your process. The other part is having a strong, process written that shows that you're using those objective guidelines, that you're not just, saying, oh, I'm just going to arbitrarily look at 50 sites and we're going to go out and do that. You need to explain your process and the reasoning behind your process. And we had found that every inspector that we met with and every agency that came out and looked, when we were able to say, this is our process, it is risk-based. These are the factors that we use to determine this based on the risk level of our study. And then this is how we move forward. They were all very happy with that. They said, that is great. That is what we expect to see. Keep doing what you're doing. And it's working. So it really just comes down to being able to, that show me part, there's the tell me and the show me. Having that show me set up really well is what really gets you across the finish line.
When you're evaluating a study, like what are the top signs, the tells that show you whether a TMF is truly inspection ready?
So I can go into a TMF as a former CRA and, from oversight perspective, we spend a lot of time in a TMF. We're not as hands-on as our TMF department, but we are in there working within that TMF a lot. So I can tell pretty quickly, if I go in and I'm looking for monitoring reports, I mean, that's a very basic thing. Those should all be filed. They should be filed as soon as they're approved. There shouldn't be any issue. Unfortunately, we find all the time that we have missing monitoring reports, missing follow-up letters, missing pieces to that. So then we also go, we look at the report and the report says, oh, well, I collected training for this person and this person. So we pop and look to see if that training's filed. Oh, nope, that training's not filed. So now not only is there an issue with the fact that the TMF isn't updated, but now your report isn't really accurate because you say you collected it, but we don't have it, which is why that timely filing takes place is so important. But so it's very easy to tell from my perspective, from a monitoring perspective, if the health of the TMF is in a good place or not, based on just looking at the very basics. They tell you a lot, and you really can unravel, that yarn or open that can of worms very quickly when you start digging around just a little bit. And if it's a one-off, sometimes there's just a person that's not great about filing their documents, or there's, just oops, we're all human, we forget to do something. But it's pretty quickly to tell when it's a systemic issue across the team, and working with them to really get those numbers back up again.
You said something really interesting and very true. Let's say I'm an eTMF specialist, you're the CRA. We have missing monitoring reports. Help me understand why. Like, what's not going on the back end? Why can't we get them
Yes.
in?
So I have found a couple of reasons that this happens. So, for example, a TMF that I was recently working in was owned by the sponsor and not the CRO. The CRO's normal process was, if it was their TMF and they owned it, when that report was finalized, it automatically went into their TMF because their CTMS system was set up to just, send it over.
Mm-hmm.
So when they started working on the study that we were on, where we owned the TMF, not everybody on the team was aware that it didn't automatically transition into our system the way that they were used to on their other studies. So what we found out was it was a lack of training, or, training comprehension, that they actually had to manually pull that report and put it into the TMF. So I've seen that one a lot. That one's pretty common. Sometimes you'll see confusion between whether is the CRA supposed to submit it once it's approved, or does the trip report reviewer submit it once it's approved. So again, that communication and training and understanding. So it becomes oh, well, I thought this person was going to do it. Oh no, that person was supposed to do it. So that can be an issue. Sometimes, and I see this a lot from my oversight perspective, it's actually one of my key risk indicators, is my CRA overworked. So my CRA have too much on their plate. They're on the road all the time. They have too many sites. They have so many visits that they don't have a day in the office to file all of their documents. They don't have a day where they can catch their breath and do those things. So if I see it across like a study, like where it's a chronic issue, the first thing that leads me to think is, we're on the verge of burning out our staff. And what do we do to rectify this? Because it's becoming a resourcing issue.
Yeah, I feel like it always boils down to what you said, communication and training. And how do we fix that? Because I know with training, we're always so busy and it's kind of always on the back burner. Like, I'll get to it. And then other competing
Yes.
priorities.
That has been an issue across every side of research that I've worked on. I mean, I've worked site side, I've worked CRO side, I'm sponsor side. And yes, unfortunately, training does kind of get pushed to the back burner sometimes. And I think that the way that we provide training isn't always adequate either. But if you give a document and you give a quiz on it, then that person's going to push it off and not do it. But if you give a document and you don't give a quiz on it, then they may just open it and never actually read it, and you can't confirm that they comprehend it. So we try to do a monthly training call with our CRAs, and it is recorded. So if the CRAs are on site and they're unable to make it, or they're, traveling or something, they can go back and listen to it afterwards. But during that call, when we meet with them, so we meet, as the sponsor, as oversight, we meet with the CRA team once a month, where we go over the important things. This is the trends that we're seeing. This is what's not getting, done the way that we would like to see it. This is what you are doing great. Please continue to do this. These are the trainings that are outstanding. And then open the floor to questions so that they can ask, oh, I did read this, or I haven't had time to read this. Can you give me a quick high level before I go out next week, before I get it done, because I am going to be busy. So I think that having that level of transparency with your teams is helpful. And that's just from a sponsor, to a CRO level where I'm currently in, but that works across the board too, whether that's your site staff, whether that's your, within the CRO here at the sponsor, just really kind of bringing everybody together. Everybody's always like, oh no, one more meeting. But, those ones tend to be very meaningful and you're able to open discussion. And then you do tend to find those blind spots in those areas that aren't being covered appropriately. And you can kind of walk through those together and come up with good solutions.
What early warning signals do you look for, like in the data or monitoring but reports that tell you something deeper that may be breaking down in the TMF?
So I mentioned how, when we look at a monitoring report, so at the sponsor level, we do a review of a percentage of the reports that the CRAs are writing. We don't necessarily read every single report every time it comes in. It's just not feasible. But from a risk-based model, we do have a percentage that we looked at based on the factors. And so, like I said, we'll read those reports. We want to make sure those reports are cohesive. So we're looking at timeliness of completion. Is the quality of the report well? Is everything completed in the report? There's no missing things. And then we do those checks. So then we say, okay, this person said they collected, all of the CVs and all of the training. We do a spot check in TMF and say, okay, yep, it looks like this has all been filed and good, or nope, this hasn't been filed and we seem to have a deficit there. And we capture those and we trend that information. So we use an oversight dashboard. Currently, I use it just in an Excel spreadsheet. Some companies use like Power BI or they have a great CTMS that captures those things for them. But you trend that information and you can kind of quickly see, okay. And again, it kind of falls back to, is this a singular CRA that's having this issue? Is the entire study team having this issue? Maybe it's project wide, all the studies that you have at a particular, place are having these issues. And then we communicate that closely to our TMF counterparts and say, hey, these are the areas that we're not seeing, these things as completeness. And then they can kind of work with how they're working with the teams to ensure that those are getting filed appropriately.
Let's chat a little bit about quality metrics that actually matter, like the ones that separate the average teams from like the high performers.
That's a great question. And I would say that from our perspective, we want to see things done timeliness. Like timeliness is probably the biggest indicator of, do we have a good team? And that's across the board. Are the reports being completed in the correct timeline? Are they being filed in the correct timeline? Are those escalations, like we talked about earlier, are those being escalated appropriately? Are the communications to the site in a timely manner? Are we responding to questions, appropriately? So we look a lot at that from an oversight perspective. And then it's that quality. Do the monitoring reports tell me what's going on at a site? Can I read a monitoring report and know and understand what happened while that CRA was on site? And some CRAs are better at doing that than others, but it's so important. I mean, that is our window, our insight into what's happening. So we really need to see, quality information. We look at things like, how often is a CRA copying and pasting information from one report to the next? And is that affecting the quality of their report? Because there are some things that, yeah, they're probably, you can, it's the same statement, if everything's good, everything's good. If you checked it and it's there, you checked it and it's there. But when we start to see that on a regular basis, it starts to deteriorate the validity of the reports, because how do I know for sure that everything was actually checked the way it was supposed to be? So that's a big one for us. So we do a lot of report review. And what we find from our report reviews is what triggers us to go out on site with CRAs. So part of our risk-based model and how we do oversight, we do both those internal, report reviews, and then we actually go out on site with CRAs for performance reviews as well. And how their reports look is a major indicator. And if I don't feel like I'm getting a good picture of what's going on at their visits, I'm going to send somebody out for a visit to see what's going on. Sometimes it is because the sites are great and there's not a lot to report and things look good. Unfortunately, more often than not, it's that the monitors aren't adequately capturing the issues that are happening at the site, and it's lacking in the reports. And when we go out on site with them, we end up finding, all of these, potential issues and errors that hadn't been reported. And, then we have to put in remediation plans and other things for the monitoring. But that's really a big one for us.
How does your approach shift when you're overseeing those high complexity trials like gene therapy or rare disease?
Again, it fall, with a high risk. So if once you've determined it's a high risk study, gene therapy does typically fall into that. There are international regulations and regulations here about how gene therapy studies are done, where there's extra, safe falls and things put into place because it's still very new. We don't really fully understand it. So there's extra safety things that have to be done. There's additional follow-up that has to be done. The long-term follow-up is longer, things like that. So we take all of that into account. And then we model our monitoring after that. So again, those primary endpoints, like I spoke of, kind of speak to how we need to look at things. And those are different on those high risk studies. There's potentially more of them, or there's more important things, if it's a safety study and they're looking for extra stuff. And you really focus your time on that. And what's so important from a monitoring perspective is understanding ahead of time what the workload is going to be so that you can properly plan for it. I have seen so many instances where we get into a study and enrollment is faster than anticipated, or there's significantly more screen failures than anticipated, or there's something that doesn't fit the mold of what you thought was going to happen. You think, oh, we're going to get, we need 200 patients. It's going to take 2 years to enroll 200 patients. And then you turn around and, oh, we have 200 patients enrolled in 6 months. So everything from a monitoring perspective has to change at that point. Your resourcing changes, your ability to keep up with SDV and understanding of what's going on, all of that changes. And so being adaptable and recognizing what that is going to need if that's what happens. So not just falling back on the, oh, well, we think this is going to take X amount of time and that's what we're going to plan for. You need to have a contingency plan. You need to be able to change on the fly. And I feel like that is an area that our industry as a whole kind of still suffers from. I feel like when we worked in COVID vaccines, for example, like I said, I have a big history there. We were good at, changing, like the change management and quickly being able to approve things and get things changed. And I feel like we've kind of digressed back into our older ways of, nope, we're going to take longer again because we can. We don't have that sense of urgency anymore. And that affects how, the progress of the study is going, because if you don't have enough monitors to go out in SDV and look at the sites and work with the site, you're not getting that insight to the data. Or, they're so heavily focused on the SDV while they're at the site that they're not looking at regulatory documents, and they're not looking at training, and they're not looking at, those important things that also need to be looked at, because they're so heavily focused on trying to keep up with one area and not the other. So really trying to keep that balance in place is, I think, the tightrope that we all walk within this industry.
Yeah, I think you're right. We've digressed since COVID. And I think it goes back to the theory, just generally speaking, give me 30 days, it's going to take me 30 days. Give me
Yes.
6 hours, I'll get it done in 6 hours.
Yes, yes. It's true. And it is. And it's an unfortunate truth. I mean, all of us are very busy in this industry. Everybody wears multiple hats and has lots of things going on and does lots of stuff. And so, we give a time frame, and so that's the date that it's due. And to deliver something early is really, out of the ordinary. That's not, it used to be that was, we would strive to, be a week or two early because we could say that we got it done. And we do seem to kind of fall back into that we're going to do it slower again, or our priorities are, different and what we get finished and completed.
Yeah, you're right. Even when I first started in clinical research, it was almost normal to get it 1 to 2 weeks early.
Mhm.
And then 5, 10 years later, it was like, whew, am I going to get this done in time?
Yeah, yeah. It has. I mean, I see it too, and I see it. I see it every day. I love to give positive feedback. In my role from oversight, I unfortunately have to give a lot of negative feedback. It's the nature of what I do. And I don't love giving negative feedback, but I try to, my stance is always that we're a team. I'm here to help. We all have the same goal. And by pointing these things out, I'm not trying to be negative. I'm trying to make sure that we're all succeeding the best that we can. And one of the things that I do is I go out of my way to look for the positive feedback so that I can give something good. And one of the things I love most is when I have a team that does do things early. I love when I have a team of CRAs. Like I have one team that I work with right now where, they have 15 days to complete their reports and have them finalized. And usually with a team, that's what you get, day 13, day 14, day 15, those reports are rolling in. I have a team where it's a small team because it's a smaller study, but they all have their reports finalized within a week of their visit. Like half of the time that they're allotted to do it. And that's phenomenal, when you're able to see that, because that, it falls back into that real time. Like I know that, they're on top of things and they're getting things in and they're doing things the way they're supposed to. And that I think a lot comes from support, is the CRO supporting their CRAs? Do they have good line management? Do they have good CTMs? Are they resourced appropriately? Are they not overworked? That's a huge, huge thing for me. So I always try to point that out when I see it. Unfortunately, it's not always available to point out, and there's many reasons for that, and that's what we try to do from an oversight perspective, is kind of find the root cause of why we don't see that. But yeah, it's interesting how it can vary so much from just one team to the next.
If someone listening wants to radically upgrade their oversight skills, like starting today, what's that one piece of advice that's going to change their game?
You need to have a written process and a dedicated person, team, position to your oversight. So many sponsors think that what their project managers or their CTMs are doing qualifies as oversight. Oh, my CTMs know what's going on at the sites. Oh, we get a KPI listing once a month from the CRO. We see what's happening, so that's our oversight. And it's just not true. And the inspectors and the regulatory agencies will tell you that when they come out to, do their inspections. They're going to say, this doesn't qualify as oversight. You really have to have a true oversight process, and it needs to be as proactive as possible. It doesn't just mean being reactive to everything. So it's not just, oh, here's a fire, let's put it out. It's that we see some smoke, what's going on over there? Let's, unhook the wires before it turns into the fire. So that to me is probably the most important. Like if you really want to, step back, is, do you have that in place? That is key. And then once you have that in place, then, fine tuning your processes and ensuring that they work well is, the next step of that. But really just at this point within our industry, I mean, oversight is still a fairly new area within our industry. I mean, it's, the last 8 years, I would say, is when we've really, kick started this, is like, this is actually a thing that needs to be done outside of, like I just said, what is normally happens. And a lot of sponsors and a lot of people in our industry have this idea that, well, we don't have to do it until we get dinged for it. And then when they get dinged for it, they put it in place as their remediation. But that's not the best way to handle things. And I think at this point, the industry has really shown that this is something that they're looking for. I was very fortunate that we went through all of our inspections without any critical findings. And that was because one of the first questions that was asked in all of those inspections was, what is your oversight of your monitoring? What is your oversight of your CRO? So it's one of the very first things they've asked in every inspection I've been in the last, 6, 7 years. It, top 5 questions from them is show me your oversight plans. How does this work? So they really need to be cognizant of that at this point.
So at the end of the show, I always ask these 2 questions to every guest. And the first one is, what's your favorite TMF record and why?
Well, I think my favorite TMF record is monitoring reports. And, and I think that's probably kind of self-explanatory based on what I do. But to elaborate on that, I mean, they're so important to the insight of what's happening with your trial. I mean, if you want to know pretty much anything about what's going on with your study, if you look at a monitoring report, it's going to tell you what's happening, your safety information, your action items, your everything really boils down to monitoring. So to me, that's my favorite because I think it gives really good insight into what's going on with your study. And if they're written well and they are, done the way they're supposed to be and filed, it really shows that you have, a good active trial and things are moving the way they're supposed to.
And lastly, what's the best career advice you've ever received and who was it by? And it doesn't have to be like clinical research, just any career advice.
Oh my goodness. I'm very fortunate. I've had some very wonderful mentors in my life, and especially in my research career. I've had several people that have really taken me under their wing over the years and led me to where I'm at. And I think the best advice that I've gotten overall is probably don't be afraid to ask questions. There is stupid questions, but that's okay. Like, everybody likes to say there's no stupid questions. Well, there are some questions that are, but that's okay. Don't be afraid to look a little dumb and ask the questions. Speak up from all sides. When I was a study coordinator, don't be afraid to ask the questions at the investigator meeting. Don't be afraid to speak up on that, training call. If you're thinking it, somebody else is thinking it too. And then people look to you and they realize, hey, this person's thinking about, what's going on. They're not checked out. They're not, disassociated. They're actually paying attention. And then that's how you make connections with other people. And that is so important, especially in research, is, networking and learning from other people that do what you have done or doing other things that relate to what you're doing. Pick their brain, ask questions, ask to meet and, have coffee, or even if it's virtual, I still regularly talk to people that I've met through LinkedIn or I've met at a conference or, as a site associate or, a CRA that I formerly worked with. I love to talk to people and, hear what they're going through, hear how they're processing things, and never be afraid to learn more because none of us know everything. And the beehive or the collective mind is a wonderful thing, particularly in this industry, but I think across all industries, it's probably the same.
Ellie, I just want to honor you for what you brought today, like your level of clarity, your mastery, your leadership. That is rare. And I know our TMF Elite here, they're going to be walking away so different because of you. And just thank you so much for pouring into this community, raising those standards, and just showing us like what that world-class oversight really looks like. It's just been an absolute privilege having you here today.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you and, share what I've done and the things that we've done in the industry so far. It's great. I love sharing, my history and the knowledge that I've gained. And I love, talking with other people about that and getting their insights on it. I think that's what makes us great is sharing and, like I said, really making those connections because the more we talk about the things, the more insight we get to them and we get to think of things in a different way. So I really appreciate you and your questions today. They've made me think about what I've done and how things work and I really appreciate being here.